Yes, thank you very much. I want to talk about the defense spending report. I was trying to wrap my mind around this enormous number. And so what I kind of understand is the federal government collects about 17 cents out of every dollar that the Canadian economy produces. And under this new NATO framework, defense and security spending could rise to 5 cents. So that would leave us with 12 cents for all of our other spending. Now, if our revenue remains about 17% of GDP, that means close to 1/3 of our federal revenue would go to defense and security. And it's not a marginal adjustment. It makes defense one of the dominant pillars of federal spending. It would represent a very different fiscal profile from Canada that Canada has historically had. So now I want to consider the industrial side. Large-scale defense manufacturing is capital intensive. To sustain it efficiently, most countries rely on export markets. The United States does, France, Germany, and the UK. If Canada builds production capacity beyond what we need for our own security, then one of two things happens. Either we permanently maintain elevated domestic military demand, or we participate meaningfully in global defense export markets. So here's my question. Given that Canada has long positioned itself as a middle power focused on multilateralism and peacekeeping, does expanding defense production at this scale represent a material shift in our fiscal priorities and even in our national identity?
Thank you. Thank you for the very complicated question. We're always kept on our toes. So I can certainly answer the fiscal component. So there are two parts. There are two parts from my own perspective. There are two interesting parts to the question that you're asking. The first is well within our bailiwick with respect to the fiscal side. So we published a report on the NATO 5% target and the potential fiscal implications, which, again, the numbers that you cited in terms of the 17 cents on every dollar, or 70% of GDP, getting to 5 cents of that with respect to NATO, that's correct. It would be a substantial increase. Within the NATO 5% report that we published, we did point out that going from 2 to 5%, about half of that, the government's indicated it would be, they believe that they're already spending on other areas that are potentially dual use or dual purpose. That said, would be 5 cents out of the potential 17 cents if there are no other changes on the revenue side, which would be a substantial difference in the allocation of spending in comparison to what we've seen in the past. With respect to the question that you raised with respect to the change in the composition or the nature of the Canadian economy, it's something that definitely caught my eye, because up to this point we've been looking at this as a fiscal question in terms of how much will this cost and over what period of time. The defense policy last week was interesting because it indicated it's also an economic question. So in comparison to the past, where the government was focusing on spending the money to acquire military kit, now it's spending the money to acquire military kit and also substantially expanding the defense industry within the country, and in many situations supporting the creation of firms that currently don't exist to get to a 70% domestic spending target. And in a context where we currently have a bit of an output gap, so there's currently some slack in the economy, which we expect to close over time, but in the context where the government's going to be pushing very strongly around the restructuring, restructuring the Canadian economy in this area and expanding it, it will change the nature of how the economy operates overall.
Okay, so I just have a kind of a follow-up question. Since we're increasing defense spending so dramatically, and apparently the Prime Minister is planning to sign a defense cooperation agreement on his trip to India this week, my question is defense becoming just a security function of it, just a security function, or is it becoming a central economic strategy? I think that's the main question that I have. I'm not sure you can answer it, but perhaps during your study of this issue, you ran into some information you didn't include in your report.
I would say so to answer your question, we did not include the economic context or the changing economic context in our report because we were waiting for the defense strategy that was published after we published our NATO 5%, subsequent to our NATO 5% report. And again, it is a substantial difference in comparison to the approach the government's taken in the past, and including on the export side. So it was very explicitly identified within that report that there would be a shift to, in addition to creating domestic capacity to meet Canada's needs, also supporting the exports of military equipment and hardware. So that's certainly different.